we're going to continue with that work. We asked and tasked Claudia to lead this panel a few weeks ago, and she quickly brought together a very distinguished panel of experts, not only in the field of engineering education, but equity, representing students that are not typically represented in the P-12 engineering education sector. So the title for this session today that we tasked Claudia to wrap our heads around, challenge us with as we look at the learning progressions and the work that we're doing, is called Addressing Engineering Pathways for All. The questions are up there. We asked Claudia to circle them in, weave them out, get us to think, provoke some thoughts. And so we hope that you ask some questions after or during or however Claudia wants to hand over Oprah-style presentation today. She may be giving out cards and learning progressions and focal points. So, light introduction. Ms. Claudia Morel, she introduced herself yesterday. She's actually she's our project manager for a research grant that we're doing in Baltimore County. She works very closely with UMBC. Nationally recognized, she worked at UMBC. We have a list. We don't have. I could take a whole hour to describe all of her. Dr. Taryn Bale, she's at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Carolyn Parker, who was at Johns Hopkins University and is now at American University, and Miss Alicia Sparks, who is at Johns Hopkins Educational Outreach Center. Correct? Yep. And so on that note, I'm going to pass it off to Ms. Claudia Morel.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you. And so one of the things that I wanted to do today is just begin by doing a brief introduction about what we're trying to do. We're really trying to serve all students. One of the goals, we talked about goals, and we focused a lot on the teachers, but ultimately we always have to remember we have to pay attention to our students. And wherever we come from, our students may look a little bit different or be a little different ages, different backgrounds, race, ethnicity, whatever. But the goal of it really is to make sure that every student is successful, right? Regardless of their demographics. That's something we want to pay attention to make sure they're included. It's not something we want to distinguish them for, rank them for some reason because of. So what we ended up doing is I introduced yesterday this idea of creating an equitable learning environment that every teacher can close their door, and we see it all the time when we talk about top 100 STEM teachers every year by NSF. They close their door and they create an equitable learning environment everywhere in the country for every age student with multiple different processes in place. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. There is no 10-step process. There's no silver bullet except for the teacher in that classroom. That is the silver bullet. And so what we want to do is give our teachers as many tools and resources as they can to be successful. But here's the thing. I want to make a remark from a comment yesterday, which is we have to also recognize that every teacher that goes into a classroom does so for the love of the students. So they're there because they're well-intended. This is not a judgment. It's not a criticism. This is not these people do it right and these people do it wrong. Everybody is doing the best they can. So that's where we start from. It really is about creating awareness. And that requires a number of things, and I'm going to let these folks talk about what they've done and how they've done it, but it really requires something very important. And I know that people talk about this book called Lean In. I haven't read the book, but the idea of leaning in is a very old one. And it is simply this. When I see something, my dear friend Taryn is sitting next to me, if I see something that I think she needs to know that the world doesn't need to know, to help her, I'll lean in. I'll say, Taryn, you got some spaghetti or something on your teeth. I want to take care of that. See how we did that? Now, when I did that, Taryn may come back to me, if I don't know her very well, and go, who the hell are you for telling me? I go, Or she could be, oh, thank you so much. I don't know. I am taking a risk in giving you that information. I stood behind a woman in a bank and I watched all these people in line looking at this woman because she had something stuck to her rear end. I did not know who she was, but I thought, I do not want to go around the whole day with something stuck to my rear end. So I leaned in very quick and said, ma'am, I think you have something on your pants. She's like, oh my God, thank you. Just ran off, took care of it, some sort of sticker or something. Came back, I'm like, here's your place back. That's when I say lean in. But it requires, when we talk about this work, it requires that people from different backgrounds lean in and tell each other and create visibility around what's not visible. And I mentioned yesterday, Alicia leaned in a little bit and told us about how some people may experience these beautiful surroundings as a plantation, which would make them really uncomfortable. see it. I didn't know it. It was completely invisible to me. I'm very grateful to my friend for sharing that with me and creating some awareness. I think about the times when I was very poor student, and we'd go out and I'd say to everybody, you know, well, this is a beautiful dinner, gotta go, love it, everything. And then at the end of the dinner, everybody who had jobs or had more wealth would say, all right, let's just split the dinner 4 ways. Well, I got the cheapest thing on the menu and skipped the liquor. They all had 3 glasses of liquor and got the most expensive and appetizers and desserts, and now I'm somehow responsible and I'm embarrassed. Do I lean in and say, I can't afford to split this? But I will tell you, what I have always done is paid attention to my colleagues at the table and thought carefully about who's got wealth and who doesn't, and made sure that I now, who have access to resources, will offer always, and in fact sometimes insist that I pick up the check, because I never want anybody else to have to be in that position. But it's because I have that awareness of my own experience. So one of the things we're talking about is, how do we create, first, an understanding of our students so that we are building something that meets their needs, that is focused on their needs, that we can then help teachers by giving them the tools in their toolbox so that they can go to their communities and do just that. And so I'm going to start here by asking a few questions that I'm going to ask these folks to address who have successfully done this, right? So we're not just saying, go forth and figure it out. We're saying, good news, there's lots of evidence of success when you put this in place. Fair enough? So it's framing everything. All right, so I'll let these folks introduce themselves again if they want to. And just make some opening remarks. And Dr. Bales?
Okay, so I'm Taryn. I have worked as a chemical engineer for part of my career, and I've also been an educator at the university level, but I've also been, probably most importantly, a stay-at-home mom. And while I was a stay-at-home mom, I spent a lot of time volunteering at my kids' school because they took science out of the curriculum when they were in elementary school. So I was one of those crazy parents that said, no, I'm going to bring in hands-on science and help these kids learn about math and science. And of course, because I was an engineer, I had to throw a little bit of that in too. And in the work that I've done a lot with Claudia and Carolyn and Alicia was developing different programs to help students feel included and see that engineering is really a wonderful pathway. And hopefully to remove a lot of the barriers that I saw working as an engineer in the 70s. So that's kind of my motivation.
I'm Carolyn Parker. I've had the privilege of working with everyone up here. I describe myself traditionally as a science educator, but it was Taryn who turned me on to engineering education when I was a faculty member at UMBC. And I think about my own schooling. I was a good student, white kid up in upstate New York, went to a good comprehensive high school, but I really didn't know what engineering was. I knew what science was. Science was very accessible, but I didn't really know what engineering was. And when I was first exposed to the meaning of engineering education, I thought to myself, man, I wish I had known that when I was younger. Because I think I really would have enjoyed and been interested in the engineering design process, thinking about how one solves problems in a much more applied fashion than we do in the science education world, or that we do in the science world. So I think about that a lot as we're in the age of next generation science standards, which explicitly discuss and present the importance of engineering education, and does a pretty nice job for the first go out the gate of distinguishing, because we haven't seen engineering education really in national science education standards previous to next generation science standards. So I think for a first go out the gate of science standards of curriculum standards that describe engineering versus science, I think we do a pretty nice job of distinguishing those two fields, because they are distinct fields. They have some interconnections and they have some relationships, but they are distinct fields. So I come to this talk as a former high school science teacher who entered the field of higher education as really a science educator, and I used to say I dabbled in engineering education when I worked with Taryn, because there was no engineering educator over at UMBC when we wrote our first NSF grant. We had an NSF grant funded in 2003, it wasn't that long ago, 2003, that worked with Baltimore County, developing some of the first engineering education curriculum for high schools teaching. For Maryland, yeah, for Maryland. So that's how I've ended up, that's how I have come to be here. And then I've worked for the last 7 years up at Johns Hopkins, and I have had the privilege to work with Alicia Sparks and Christine Newman. We have an NSF grant up here in Baltimore City called SABE, STEM Achievement in Baltimore Elementary Schools. And I'll talk more, I think, I don't want to steal, Alicia's here, I'm like, how am I going to talk about that? I will talk more about the in-school.
Okay.
The SABE's grant has a very comprehensive in-school curriculum component where we've developed units for grades 3 through 5 that explicitly get teachers to do engineering with their students in classrooms. So we're talking very, very young students, grades 3 through 5. And now what's very nice is, for all of you who've been involved in large comprehensive projects, you have this project, you throw in the $7 million to the community, the grant ends, and suddenly everything goes away. What's been very different in my experience with this project is we've had such a close relationship with our colleagues at Baltimore City Schools that we've worked with them to get money from the Maryland State Department of Education to not only scale up the curriculum development in grades K1 and 2, so it'll be the first time in a long time that Baltimore City Schools has had a comprehensive science curriculum that includes engineering education. But we've also been able to sustain it and spread it out to more schools than the initial schools from the NSF grant. So I think real kudos to our Baltimore City colleagues for really working in that. And as this panel progresses, I'll talk more about what we've done in the in-school to make that curriculum accessible for all students, and the importance of starting young with students. Back in the day, back when I started in higher ed, the initial research about girls and science is you started in middle school. Well, now 15, 20 years later, we are now understanding you start much earlier than that. You start down in pre-K, exposing students to science. And unfortunately, we're in an age where science is not emphasized in the elementary schools because it's not an assessed subject. So oftentimes mathematics and reading are privileged, particularly in low-performing settings, because that's where the schools are assessed, that's where the principals are assessed, that's where the teachers are assessed. So science is often forgotten. We won't even talk about social studies, where social studies is at. But you start early, you embed it, you have the conversation that this is important for all students, you make that explicit, that this is something that needs to be rolled out and exposed. All students need to be part of that conversation, and families need to be part of that conversation very, very early. So we'll talk about more of that as we go along, but Alicia will talk with you about their work.
So good morning, everyone. So excited to be here again with you all today. I bring the perspective of both being an educator in informal and formal STEM education. I was a former high school math teacher here in Baltimore City. I've done work at the middle school level in STEM outreach, and now in the elementary school with STEM outreach. But I also bring the perspective of being a minority student in a STEM field. So I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics. I went to a small, historically black college in South Carolina. When I say small, I mean smaller than my high school, so I mean small. And then I came to initially work on a PhD in mathematics at UMBC here in Baltimore. And I went from a small HBCU environment to an environment where I was the only full-time black graduate student in my department. An experience where the only people who I saw that looked like me daily were the custodians that worked in my building. And so I'll talk to you some about that perspective as an underrepresented minority in the STEM field and how we may be able to transfer and translate some of that over into engineering education in the B-12 environment.
Thank you. Okay, well, so we'll start with a series of questions. How can K-12 educators ensure all students gain awareness and meaningful access to courses and programs that can lead to a career in engineering? Should I start at the top? Or do you want to Yeah, I had said to them they don't have to answer all the questions. They're welcome to. But we'll just go ahead and get started. Alicia, you want to start?
You're so kind.
Well, no, I think you
Everybody.
should. You have the most amount of experience.
I think that how we help is we illuminate and expose. And when we talk about illuminating, we talk about in two different fashions. So when we talk about students, as educators, whether formal or informal, we have to know who our students are. We have to know what makes them tick. We have to know their strengths and weaknesses. We have to know their fears and what makes them excited. And I think we use all of that work to help inform our work in the classroom or in the out-of-school time setting or other settings to help engage them in STEM, specifically engineering. The other piece around illumination is we have to know ourselves. So we have to know what our personal background, education background, and how that influences how we interact with our students and try and engage them in the fields that we're interested or may work in, and how that informs our work in the classroom. The second piece I think we have to think about is exposure. So how do we expose students as often, as much as possible to STEM and engineering in particular? I think about our work through the SABES program. One of our teachers a few years ago was in a summer training program with us for out of school time. And she said, she's a Latino teacher, and she said, if I would have known what engineering was when I was a child, I probably would have been an engineer. And that spoke volumes to me, because the chance that the only reason possibly that she's not an engineer is because she simply didn't know what it was. And so when I think about my own personal journey, my sister also has a bachelor's in mathematics, and she's 4 years ahead of me. But outside of my sister, I did not meet an African-American mathematician or statistician until after I graduated from undergrad. Now, some might say, you went to school and excuse me, you went to school and majored in math. How did you not encounter that? And you were at a historically black college. I was. But many of our faculty did not necessarily have terminal degrees. And those who had terminal degrees in my field, you may have one course with them, or they may not be African American. And so we want to expose students to experiences as much as possible and as many different people as possible. I always say, when I started this work years ago at UMBC, I used to say I would love it if all of our students go into STEM or engineering. That's not the reality of our work. But we want to position ourselves such that students understand what's available to them. They have access to quality and strong academic foundations, so that they can major in a STEM field, specifically engineering, if they're interested in doing so.
I'm taking notes on Alicia's talk, because I've got to give a similar talk next Friday at AU, and she's not going to be with me. So I want to make sure I include.
Steal all of your good ideas.
Like, oh, that was fabulous.
Sure you can. We're
No,
educators.
because you, to add to what Alicia has talked about, I think from an institutional perspective, as I said before, we need to start early. We need to start at pre-K. We need to push the idea that science and engineering, that STEM is important in the elementary schools. That reading and math are not the privileged subjects. I mean, they are from the assessment institutional standpoint, but from the intellectual point of view and bringing students into the STEM fields, we need to start much earlier than we often think about. Need to start at the pre-K level. We need to do explicit outreach into the community and into homes. I always think about when I taught high school chemistry, and I would have parents coming into my classroom and saying, I am just going to be thrilled if my child gets a C in chemistry, because I did so poorly in chemistry. I'm just going to be happy if they get a C and make it through your class. And I thought to myself, what does that culturally say in the way we perceive science, science and engineering as a society, that people are just happy with C's? You don't hear them saying that to an English teacher. You don't hear them saying that to a social studies teacher. You hear that in the sciences, that science is perceived and engineering is perceived as something that someone else does, not necessarily that we do as a culture. So I think as STEM educators, as science and engineering educators, it is incumbent on us to change that message. And this was being said to me in a school that was fairly affluent and filled with students from dominant culture. We're not even talking about parents of children of color, of underrepresented students, of low socioeconomics. So I think when you look at how STEM is messaged in communities that are not necessarily STEM-philic, I think the message needs to be even stronger and needs to be made more explicit and needs to be institutionalized. Alicia has done a fabulous job of leading the charge with our grant up here in Baltimore, in helping us understand how to reach out into the community. I don't think as an institution Hopkins does that very well. And you have been just fabulous in doing that. So thank you over the last 4 years of that work, getting us out there. So that starts very early. And it's a message. I mean, you think about little faces coming into a classroom. They are little scientists. They are little engineers. I think we've all had experience with little kids. What do? They pick things up. They touch things. They examine things. They think about things. They ask questions. Why? We need to build on that in the elementary schools and continue that trajectory into the middle and the high school. We need to change the culture of, back when I was a student back in the day, the overheads on the overhead projector. Now it's PowerPoints. You know, it's the infusion of technology. It's very teacher-facilitated, teacher-focused instruction with a computer instead of an overhead projector and an acetate, is what it is. It hasn't changed that much, our type of instruction as we move up. I think there's also, there's making the message explicit that this is for everyone, would be my third point about that. Then there's also just very institutional structures we need to put into place. Algebra, 15 years ago it was algebra by 9th grade. Now it's algebra by 8th grade. If you can get algebra by 7th grade, that's even better. Because if you don't have the algebra in the middle school, in traditionally middle school grades, then students are not, and rigorous algebra, and that rigorous algebra, getting kids teed up to take algebra by 8th grade, again, is an issue back down into the elementary schools, that you have teachers prepared to teach that math in the lower elementary grades, in grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, getting the students ready to take algebra by 8th grade. If students don't have algebra by 8th grade, they're not going to be ready to take the higher level science and mathematics classes in high school, and that's not going to be getting them ready to take those classes in either a community college or a 4-year college. It's a pipeline issue. You look at the number of remedial classes, remedial math classes students take as they enter a community college. It's huge, and students don't get credit for those remedial math classes. So they're paying to take those classes, but it's not counting towards their degree, and then they're not transferring that into a 4-year degree. So it's something that starts in the very lower grades, and there's critical points in what we've traditionally called the pipeline, where we're losing students. And so much of it has to do with the interface of mathematics and science.
Let me, because I got a feeling we're going to be able to get some of that additional comments, if you don't mind, in the additional questions. Let me just give Taryn a couple minutes to also jump in.
Okay.
This is good information. This is good thinking. Thank you.
So I kind of look at things perhaps a little bit differently. And again, I think, Alicia did an excellent job of painting the picture of what she faced. And I was in a similar but very different situation. When I look back under my undergraduate career, or graduate career, I've never had a female faculty member, period. In an English class, in a math class, in a chemistry class, nowhere, right? So, part of it is because I'm old. But I remember, thanks Liz. But I think about that all the time, that when I meet with students. And I talk about students, the toddlers that my colleagues have that come into my office, and I get on the floor with them and I pull out my science lab and we make volcanoes and we mix colors and we do those kinds of things together. And for me, that's what I think is important, is meeting the student of where they are, whether it's a 2-year-old or a 22-year-old. I think it's really important to put yourself in their shoes, figure out what they see, figure out where they are. And I think it's less about the curriculum. And I'm not trying to disagree with Carolyn. It is important to have really strong math and science skills. But I think it's also important to figure out where that student is. And once you know where that student is, you help them recognize what makes them feel comfortable. Are they driven by seeing role models? Are they driven by solving an engineering problem that has a societal issue behind it? It's helping them figure out what's comfortable for them. And then for me, when I look at this of how can they get access to these programs, once our students know what makes them tick, then I help them find the right program that's the right match. It might be that they start at a community college and take because of financial backgrounds, not everybody can go to a school and pay $40,000 a year to go to college. So I think, again, I guess my message is that you need to figure out who your student is, help your student figure out who they are, and what will motivate them, and what they need their surroundings to be for them to be successful, and then help them find those programs. Because I think those programs exist out there, the whole gamut of, you can be one of 400 kids in an engineering classroom versus one of starting hands-on day one in a classroom of 30. So it's finding that right fit. And I always tell students that you need to figure out what you are and what makes you tick and what will help you be successful, and visit those schools. Sit in on classrooms. Don't talk to faculty. Don't talk to faculty, talk to other students and ask their perspectives, and that will help them be successful. So that's my 2 cents.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the third question, Alicia, because you alluded to the challenges traditionally underrepresented students face when considering the broad range of engineering options. So hit us with it.
I think I'll start with, which many of us have probably already heard, imposter syndrome. So one of the things for my transition going into UMBC, into the graduate program, did they slip up and let me in by accident? I'm the only one here. Am I supposed to be here? Do I know enough to be here? Can I be successful in this work? And so I think that's something that we need to be mindful of and support people with the resources that they need to be successful. Taryn talked about, knowing your students and helping them grow and finding the right match. And part of that match is having the resources available around them based on what they need. So whether that is other role models in the field, so STEM professionals, engineering professionals, whether that is faculty who you know. And so maybe it's just a matter of connecting. When I worked at city schools, we did a lot of stuff around bullying, and it's really time. But one of the things that my colleagues would do with our parents oftentimes was connect a parent with someone in the school who he or she could trust and build a relationship with. And I would translate that over to this work in engineering, finding someone in the department, a faculty member, and maybe outside of the department, a faculty member who can help you adjust to where you are and help support you in your endeavors. The same thing can happen at the high school level when we talk about P12 as well as engineering education. The other thing that I would say is a coursework and environment that wasn't designed with me in mind. So Claudia talked about what my experience is here. This actually reminds me of the Hopkins Club that we have on campus. And so when we are creating our classroom environments, when we are creating our school building environments, what is it that's welcoming to all people, and how can we make sure everyone is represented in that classroom and in that building? Because if I'm comfortable somewhere, it makes it a lot easier to focus on the work. If I'm uncomfortable, I can't even get to the place where I'm focusing on the problem or the task ahead of me. But I can focus, if I'm comfortable, I can at least attempt to focus on that and then use what I know and try and be successful in that particular course or experience.
gonna say, well, I'm probably not just gonna say 2 words, but I'm gonna, to number 2, I'm gonna say teacher education. I am now the Director of Graduate Teacher Education at American, and I just think, I'm just so pleased to be in that role because how important teachers are in helping students and families and communities understand the importance of STEM. And it's everything Alicia said, knowing, and everything Taran said, knowing students, garnering those resources, but without a good teacher who helps facilitate that in a K through 12 setting, it's just not gonna happen.
So I'm going to just ask a question, Carolyn, because there's another piece that you may not know about her. She's also a mom.
I am a mom.
And she has 2 children. And one of them, both of them, one of them is adopted?
My 11-year-old is adopted.
From
Guatemala. She's Latina.
So you've had personal experience also with raising an underrepresented child in the school system and have pushed up against some of the...
Some of the assumptions of what she should know and what she can do.
Okay. Is there anything
Absolutely.
you want to share from that experience?
I mean, there,
And I've caught you totally off guard.
I
You
know,
wanna
you
think
caught me
about it?
totally off guard.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
and
You want to come back to that in a minute? Let's let Taran talk and you can...
no, I think, you know, it goes back to, it's related to imposter syndrome. What we expect when we have a sea of faces in front of us, what we have culturally and from our families been led to assume about groups of students. And it's the idea of deficit discourse. I mean, all the labels we put to it in academia. But I think about it a lot when I just came down from home, which is upstate New York, which is primarily white, primarily Protestant. And you know, people will say, well, I don't see color. You know, my child doesn't see color. We all see color. I mean, to go and say we don't see color, I think is denying that we all do see color, and it's well documented within the literature, within the research literature, that people do see color, whether we want to believe it or not, whether we want to admit to it or not. It is what we do with our viewpoints and do with that understanding of color and the expectations we set for students that I think we have some intellectual control and emotional control over. To understand the assumptions one makes when you see a brown child in a classroom and what that child brings to the classroom or what we assume they do not bring to the classroom. I think it needs to be front and center within teacher education and with our own education when we work with educators. And it can't be removed. You know, we like to, you know, the cultural assumption is, well, science is so objective, you know, mathematics, engineering. Well, it's not. It's still a cultural practice. You are working with people. The 2 women to my left and right have made that much more explicit than I am, knowing your students and what they bring. And I do think about it with my daughter, with Tori, because she is Latina, and what teachers assume about what she knows and what she doesn't know. You know, I am the mama bear, you know, for all the mothers out there. I am the mama bear about that. You know, the minute I think a teacher's not providing her with the same system of supports as she would a child to her left or right, or my son, he's got the Irish half of me. I have a son by birth and I have a daughter through adoption. You know, I'm aware of that, but it's what we do as a society, what we intellectually do with our own biases and beliefs to create that equitable learning environment. Because I think we all do have biases and beliefs. Some are more willing to admit it than others.
Thank you.
That are innately.
And I'm sorry to dump you on that, but I thought that was really important. Thank you.
Very
You shared that.
Yeah.
Taran.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've had the privilege of teaching at UMBC, and when I looked at my students at UMBC, huge diversity, and I love that. And every single student in that classroom was beyond capable of doing the engineering challenges that I gave them that particular semester. And I think that you have to create an environment where everyone in that classroom believes that they can succeed, right? And embrace that when they create something, when they design something. Well, maybe it doesn't work exactly right, but you, as engineers, we learn so much more from our failures than we learn from getting it right the very first time. So I think it's really important to create that environment where the students, first of all, feel that everybody in that classroom, and especially the teacher, is cheering for them to be successful, and yes, that they can do it. And that they can work in teams where everybody can share their ideas, they can have disagreements, but they can learn to work together. And within that environment, it's important that they know that they don't have to get it right the first time, right? And that they can learn from those failures. And so I mean, that was one of the best things at UMBC, was having this incredibly diverse classroom. And, you know, that's something that I haven't seen quite as much at the University of Pittsburgh, which I'm now, my next challenge is to, you know, make that happen at Pitt.
So I'm going to hassle you too.
Okay.
And so Tara shared with me a bias about African American students that she was kind of aware of at UMBC. Do you want to share that? I found it fascinating. Meyerhoff?
Oh, the Meyerhoff program. So the Meyerhoff program, for people that are from Maryland probably are familiar with it, but from outside may not be. But it's a scholarship program it's not specifically for underrepresented minority students, but what it is for students that are willing to be open-minded and to be supportive of people that are underrepresented groups. So you can be a Meyerhoff scholar and don't necessarily have to be a minority student. It just means that you need to be supportive of their efforts. So we would have Meyerhoff students in our classrooms that might be white males, but or it could be an African American young lady. But what I knew about all those students is that they were great, and they were all equal, and that I wanted them to all succeed in my class. And being a chemical engineer, we all know, isn't the easiest path to follow. But I think it's important to create this environment that all of these bright kids have all of this, you know, great opportunity to become engineers and to be supportive of one another. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for.
Well, one of the things that Taryn had said to me, and what I'm sort of trying to get at a little bit, is because it is a large percentage of, she says so many things to me. What was that? She said, because of the Meyerhoff program, because it is a predominantly African American community, because you would think those are folks who are going to be particularly supportive of African American students, she would start with the assumption in the class that if there's an African American student, they're probably a Meyerhoff scholar. So putting that idea sort of in your head, that that's maybe where they're coming from, I'm going to expect the best from these students. And that's really, I think, what Carolyn is sort of touching on. What are we bringing into the classroom when we walk in about our assumptions around race and class and gender and all these other things? And if you start with the assumption that everybody in here is a scholar student, if you just start with that assumption, the students will also rise to the challenge, right?
They'll meet that expectation. You know, and not all of them were Meyerhoff scholars, right? So it was just that I mean, it is true. I made that assumption that everybody in my class, and I say this day one of my class, it's like, you know what, you're going to be, you know, I want you to feel comfortable to ask questions. I'm not necessarily going to be able to answer them, but I will do my homework and try to answer them. And I always tell students that, you know, back in the day, it used to be look to your left, look to your right, and one of the three of you is going to graduate, you know, in 4 years. And I always tell my students to look to the left and to look to the right and know that you are smarter than both of those kids sitting next to you.
There you go.
And then they like look at me and they go, how does that work? And I said, because I'm the stupidest person in the room and you guys are going to teach me. And it's just, I think, creating that environment where they know that they can be successful. And giving them opportunities to design and to try things and to not be afraid of failure. And I know I've said that before, but I think it's important. Yes.
Sorry, when you said the look to your left, look to your right thing, it made me think of something that the university president at Villanova says every year to the incoming class of students, and is always repeated by the Dean of Engineering and everything. He always says, look to your left, look to your right. Those are the people who are going to get you through. And I always really liked that one just because I don't think that it should be a competition. I think that you should be building a community so that the students are all friends with each other as well. It's not only the part of the teacher to make it a welcoming environment, but it's the part of the other students that you're working with as well.
No, excellent point.
I'm stealing that
Yeah,
too.
yeah, right.
We're talking
If
to all
you
the
share
science
your
TAs.
notes-
No, I'm talking to all the science TAs next Friday at.
Yeah, no, that's
That's a
really
nice
great.
change from, I got look to your left, look to your right, and if you're a woman, you're gonna have your MRS before you have your engineering degree.
Whoa. Yes.
Okay.
Claudia, is it okay if we open up for questions a little bit?
Yes, let me just go through one more. I was thinking the same thing, but I want them to get to lessons learned. That particular question. It's like, what did you walk away with? There, what are what is it that you did that changed the outcome? And let's get to questions absolutely after that. So what is it that Taryn and I looked at some programs and we sort of reverse engineered, and you all saw the structure I talked about yesterday about creating an equitable learning environment. So to create success. So I'd like you to just talk about what was. Taryn's done 1 billion programs, and every one of them has been successful. I've watched her grow programs from 50 students to 1,500 students, and it's like UMBC's engineering program exploded because Taryn was the face teacher of the year, blah, blah, blah. So why don't you just tell us about what do you do? And she's also incredibly humble, so just cut that nonsense out.
Yeah.
And just, yeah.
Well, again, I think it's creating this environment, and I think that it's different things will work for different students, right? So I kind of just threw everything at them. I think it's important for many of them to have role models. I think it's really important to do things in groups and as teams. I think it's important to allow them to fail and to learn from their mistakes. I think it's important that they have projects that are grounded in social justice or in, some real world context. But again, as I said before, I think it's less about the curriculum. It's more about figuring out who your students are and putting them in that in an environment that will help them be successful. And I guess just being their number one champion. Just cheer for them along the way and encourage them and encourage them to explore different avenues of how to get there to figure out what's best for them. So.
And failure, not everybody succeeds in engineering.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with, I've done a lot of teacher professional development, and I know that sometimes the teachers were, when it was ready for the design project, students would say, well, is this going to work? And, and the teacher says, well, I don't know, let's call up the folks from UMBC, have them come in and talk to you all. And it's not, I don't know if it's going to work, right? It's like, let's do it. Let's try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't, let's redesign that. Let's figure out how to make it work. And it's just creating that environment that they feel comfortable in trying different things. So.
Thank you.
I would say relevance. Everything needs to be relevant to the students. You think about adult learning, you think about kids. We want to learn about things we're interested in. So as much as we can make that happen for students, I think we're doing them a better service. Rigor, high expectations, expecting from every face in the room. I'll disagree a little bit with Taryn. I do think it is about the curriculum, but embedded within that curriculum needs to be ways that we get to know our students. We are not teaching curriculum, we are teaching students using a curriculum. You know, we think, you see it a lot in secondary education where I've got to teach chemistry. Well, no, you've got to teach chemistry to students, to those faces in the room. And we forget about the faces in the room and we get so caught up in our own subject matter that we forget we're teaching faces and students and minds and feelings. And
Wow, I wish I had a pen and wrote that down.
I want to say two things. One, I'll describe my classroom and kind of talk about when I taught high school, why I did those things as far as equitable learning environment and helping students engage and excel in math. But one of the things I want to caution us on, I've worked on a lot of grants and soft money. And so when you're writing proposals, a lot of times we start writing about the demographics of the communities that we serve. So a lot of times our funders, you know, underrepresented minorities, low social economic, this is what they face at home, they live in poverty. And some of what I think we experience in the classroom is that somewhere that we begin to believe that that's the only story for all of our students. And so I want to caution us on that, as a lot of us work on different programs and may work with grant funding. When I think about my classroom, most of the things that I implemented in my classroom, I actually learned from informal education. So let me start with that. So a couple of things that I did that I think can be translated into the P12 engineering classroom. We started with a writing prompt. How do you feel about math and why? Because most of my children hated math. I need to know that coming in. I need to know why they don't like math. Many times it's because they hadn't been successful at it before. Their parents said, to Carolyn's point, oh, I've never been good at math. So we started with that. In my classroom, we always had cooperation contracts. So instead of me developing the rules for my classroom each year, my students developed the rules for our classroom each year. Every class had a different cooperation contract, 5 things that they agreed to in the affirmative. One of the most powerful things that I remember one of my students in one of my 10th grade classes saying, she added to the list that we would uplift each other. And so that allows students to commit to it, they help create it, they each sign it, and you know, a lot of times for things students create, they help hold each other accountable. So that was their work and things that they had to do. Even though I was math, I had a library in my classroom. Shh, don't tell anybody. Because literacy doesn't always like to share with us in math, but I'll share with them. So I had a library in my classroom. I had a down area where students could work on puzzles when they were done. When I talked about interacting with my students, if I had a student who had challenges in math, one of the things that I may do is go over and give them a problem to start working on early. So we talk about wait time in the classroom in the sense of asking a question aloud and then waiting for students to process before we take students to get answers. But if I knew I had a student who took a little bit more time, I would go ahead and write the problem down for them and give them the opportunity to solve it. I would check it on their paper, and then miraculously, the student who was always having issues, oh, you know the answer? Come on up to the board and show us what you did and walk us through that process. And so they get an opportunity to build their confidence, and they have the time that they need to do that. When I look at more advanced students, because when we're in public school classes, we have a range of students and what they're used to. I have students, you're explaining the math problem, well, couldn't you just do this? And I would tell some of my students, if you're just getting this and you think this is gonna be completely confusing to you, just turn off your ears for one moment. And those who wanna take this journey with me, let's take this quick journey and look at another way to do this problem that may be a little bit more sophisticated or complicated. So it's speaking to the needs of all your students across the classroom.
Excellent. Thank you. Questions? Before yeah.
So you're talking about exposing kids early, kind of in the pre-K to elementary school range. So for those kids who aren't exposed early, so what's some kind of things that we can do to kind of make up for lost ground, kind of rein them back in at the middle school and high school level to try to get them interested in STEM?
I think certainly the out-of-school time setting would be a place that additional STEM could be offered, engineering and science, and could be offered to students.
So how could we like recruit them for like events and stuff like that? Because like some of our problem is like, you know, we're already getting the kids who are interested in STEM,
whose parents are signing them up.
Yeah, whose
You get my
parents are signing them up.
kids.
But how do we reach out to those kids whose parents aren't quite as involved and stuff like that?
Yeah, so
You're
one
the
of the things we
master
did
of
at Saba is master, learn it every day. One of the things we did at Saba is we had a school with low enrollment for our after school program. And so we took a day and we went, I think I took 5 team members with me, and we had all of the students at once per grade level. So that was fun. But we went in, we did a hands-on STEM thing. There were younger kids, we did slime. We talked about it, we gave out recruitment forms and kind of used that by doing a hands-on experience with everyone to help recruit students to the program. And we did get more students that way. The other piece, Carolyn talked some about engaging families. I think by nature as educators, a lot of times say, it's not my job to educate the parents, I have to educate the kids, that's enough. But to move this work forward, we have to work with families and engage families and parents. And so they have to understand the different opportunities available to their students. Because what I've come to understand, I've experienced parents in a lot of different ways. I worked in central office at city schools as well. But 99.9% of our parents are working towards what's best for their children. And sometimes they look to us because they don't know in the education arena. And so when we talk about school choice in this era and what that looks like, how do we help break that down to parents? When we talk about course choices, how do we help break that down to parents? For parents who are maybe not as comfortable with science, engineering, or math, how do we help them build on their experiences? Or one of the things I tell our after-school staff is, one of the best things about Saba's after-school program is you can answer a question with a question. So helping parents understand that students exploring and their children exploring with them and asking questions that they can't answer is okay. Give them back a question. We can research and find out together. So I think those are both ways that you can engage students that you don't necessarily.
I think you have to remember that there aren't many parents who are as comfortable in a school as I am. Every time I enter a school, I'm like, hey, I'm back in a school. I go in, I chat up the front office person, how important that person is, because they're the gatekeeper into the schools. But many students don't have parents who are comfortable in their own schooling and did not have good school experiences. They're going to be apprehensive about entering that front office. They're going to be apprehensive about engaging school teachers and community members.
Can I add on one more thing for you,
Sure.
Liz? Leverage relationships. Carolyn just talked about the front office secretary being the gatekeeper. He or she can tell you who needs to be in your program and why.
He or she can get your survey set up.
Right. And it may be, he's always tearing up stuff in the building. Oh, wait, he's reverse engineering. Let me bring him to the club. Right? And so getting them to help identify students, but also that's who talks to parents. And so if Miss Carolyn in the front office tells me that my baby needs to be in this program, my baby's going to be in this program because Miss Carolyn cares about me. She cares about my child. I've never had an issue with her, and I trust her when it comes to me and my children.
Yep.
So leveraging
Yeah, you
relationships.
leverage those relationships.
Also, bring a friend in. So have students who are already involved bring someone else to test it out and try it out, and give children a trial period. If you don't like it, you don't have to stay. It's okay. Give us 2 or 3 sessions. See if it's something that you're interested in, and if not, then you can leave. We're not going to hold you hostage because we want every child we encounter to be an engineer when they grow up. Taryn, did you want to add anything before we?
Well,
Liz,
I think Liz has a question.
Sure.
Well, I want to add to that pastors and priests approach local clergy about doing after-school stuff at their church. Parents might be more likely, or children might be more likely, or feel a little more divine responsibility to go. So don't be above using that. God's okay with that. Also, talk to if there's a parent organization at the school, talk to them about holding a family event at the community center that's nearby to take it away from the school building. And if you're going into engineering, you should know, or you have students going into engineering, you should know that in particular, some guys do it too, but I'm looking at Jamie and Karen here. We have a bat signal we put out when we hear of anyone thinking about engineering, any part of the country. We will connect them with a mentor that we know that will literally start working with them in elementary school. If we hear of a kid and their parent, they live somewhere else. She took on a kid that I met in the emergency room a month ago. His sister met me, and now she's mentoring the girl's brother. In North Carolina. In North Carolina. But we've had a lot of success in our GK-12 program doing things at community centers. And it's really hard for parents not to come when their pastor or their priest is telling them they should. Yeah.
And be cautious of the barriers for families. So when we talk about younger kids, if I need child care for my child, I can't send my child to your program for 2 hours once a week. Because that means I don't have child care the rest of the week. I have to send them to a comprehensive program. And so inserting STEM into more comprehensive programs. Or if I'm an older student in high school, then do I need to work to help bring in income, either to help with my family, or senior and junior year is expensive. So if I need to work, can we do clubs and hold things either before school or during lunch hour, or if they have a study hall period, so that more students can engage who may not traditionally be able to engage?
Just to address your question a little bit also, I think that if we put our students to work, I'm a firm believer in having them do more work than I do. And so we have had a lot of success with having students go into the lower grades and work with kids, also coming to family nights and participating at our STEM family nights at the elementary school. So we have elementary, middle school committees that our STEM kids serve on, and they really come out and do a great job of being ambassadors for the program and also mentors, as well as having big events in the community, like our annual STEM Day, or having the kids provide the showcase to other students and highlight what work they've done as a really good audience for the kids, to a very real audience. So we've done a lot of those things, and that really gets kids that haven't been exposed a lot of exposure.
Other questions?
So this is kind of a deviation, but it was a comment about some topics that we talked about a little bit earlier. So Carolyn, you talked about science as this social construct. People view it as a subjective thing, but in reality, what is taught and how it's taught was built over time and made decisions maybe 100 years ago, right? And so I think we can say similar things about engineering, right?
Absolutely.
And so the culture that helped make those decisions years and years ago might not necessarily understood or has the values of our culture today. And so the fundamental charge of this group is really to help define core content needed for high school engineering programs. And so, and we hope that that'll influence curriculum, and we understand that there's a transition, right? There's a, from the content to how it plays out in the classroom, there's a lot of things that go on in between that. But as they wrestle with these decisions about what to and not to include in terms of content, what equity or access landmines might exist in the selection of those topics. So based on your expertise in terms of what should be taught to children, are there landmines that might set up, that might limit access? And then what groups can we reach out to then to provide either expertise or review services that after we make these decisions, we aren't allowing our biases to push or pull this in any one direction?
I think you have to be very careful as a fabulous question. And I'm so pleased you're thinking about this. I think you want to be very thoughtful that you're including what we term more broadly in the ed research culturally relevant pedagogy that's going to be, or culturally relevant curriculum that will be relevant to all groups. I'm looking at the pictures on the wall. This is a plantation. I mean, this room is historically relevant to the conversation because the people who are pictured on this room did form how engineering is perceived today culturally. I think you want to be anti that. You want to move away from that. And I think, I've just been, one thing our Sabes kids do in the after school is they identify topics they want to study in the out of school time setting. We call them student-centered projects. So our facilitators, and Alicia can describe it better than me because this is part of the project she really has spearheaded. But they walk through the neighborhood and they identify what they want to study, whether it be cat houses, whether it be lead filters, but I'll go into a school, the Johns Hopkins researcher with the pointed hat, and how little kids coming up to me going, "You're from Sabes? I love the project where we build shelters for homeless cats." And and they're just speaking from the heart. It's just so important to them. So you want to think about topics that you can, relevant topics to kids that are going to make the content accessible and available to them from an interest perspective. who does that reviewing? You should speak more. Go ahead.
So, two things. One, I would say, I think when we approach teaching, curriculum, education in general, we need to always remember our students, and that be the focal point. When I came into education, my mentor teacher told me, Sparks, if you always do what's in the best interest of children, no one can ever fault you for that. So they have to be the center of our work. The second thing I would say is, if we think about our most challenging, difficult, underrepresented group, and build with that group in mind, everybody else will come.
That's a great point.
When Claudia and I were at CWIT, for some reason, she trusted me with my first full-time job. It still amazes me. Anyway, we did outreach with the middle school at 6 Baltimore County and Arundel middle schools. And the program was designed, CWIT is Center for Women in IT. So the program was designed for girls, but much like Taryn was describing with Meyerhoff, those who were supportive could participate as well. Boys would participate. So when we did all of our marketing, we did it with girls in mind. When we did our program, we did it with girls in mind. Everything was done with girls in mind. And in every one of my programs, I had boys. So if we start at that place of, what's needed by the, then everybody else is going to come along with them. But they're included in the conversation, and they will feel valued, and they'll come to the table as well.
Thank you.
Sharon, I want you to chime in here, because I know you've got some good thoughts that we want to make sure we get hold of.
Well, I mean, so going back to some of the previous question, I think like one of the first programs that we did was Computer Mania Day. And 800 middle school kids came to our day-long event. And I think what was so important about that event was we had a parallel program for the parents, right? So that the parents could, understand how they could help and be supportive of their students. And a big part of that program was having role models. And Claudia did a great job of teaching us role models. Okay, like you don't go in there and wear your stuffy suit. She had to say that to me. Go in with your jeans, and you wanted to be able to relate to the students that were a part of your program. So it's doing those kinds of things that I think really made a lot of these outreach programs that we've done from K to 12, K to 22, right? It just never ends.
K to 15.
I'm just going to add something to this comment too, because I think that I am concerned about the process. I'm always about the process, because you can't get to the, if you don't have a good map, you're not going to end up at the right place. And the process is that if we're thinking about students first, how does that inform, and we think we're thinking about our students, but we're really thinking about ourselves and our own experiences, because, it's hard to think, what does Alicia need, if you're not Alicia, right? If you're not a person of color or a person who has some, very diverse background or different experience than you do. So how do those voices show up in the work? And so I'm asking that as you think about this process, what actually needs to come out front? If we're thinking about students, how have we informed you as the developers of this curriculum so that you have the tools in your toolbox as you design this curriculum to make sure that all the different students that show up in your classrooms actually have their needs met? And I'm not sure we've gotten to answer that question yet, but is that the right question that we should be asking? Am I saying that right? Have I missed anything? Because that's the challenge of all the curriculum that's really been developed today. That hasn't, it's always stuck at the back end, not at the front end, and then they're running around kind of going, okay, so we don't have any women. And Project Leapway's solution for getting more women into engineering was to create a biology program so that they can report their data overall, and because women go into biology, they now have nice representation of women. But when you break it down, they still have challenges, but we all do. It's not, I'm not blaming Project Leapway, it's just
Right, yeah.
we have systemic challenges. I'm going to ask them to each make a final, go ahead, please.
Have them solve problems, not content areas. I mean,
Right.
give them a real world problem. These kids are worried about their future, and rightfully so. So don't tell them to do chemical engineering. Tell them that they got to deliver water from here to here. And it has to be clean and accessible in quantity. I mean, help make them responsible for doing things in a model sense that can be applied to the real world. you know, this is what women have been saying, and quite frankly, it's what my white males say.
Yeah.
You know, it's what everybody says. People want to be trained to be problem solvers, and you can't do that by reading statics. I'm sorry, I'm mechanical. Sorry, Dad. You
But
just
Liz, it's
can't.
so easy it's so difficult to assess that.
It-
And I say that completely facetiously, because we live in this larger construct of education where we want the kids to be test
It
scores.
becomes the low-hanging fruit, in my experience. That
No.
becomes the low-hanging fruit.
No, and we've got to totally transform education and schools.
Yeah, no, you
Yeah.
can eat an apple little bites at a time.
And all the hands went up.
So I see 3 hands, we're gonna get to those, I'm seeing our timekeepers. We're okay? Okay, and then we'll let them wrap up.
Sorry, my passion just got out of me.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right.
Yeah. Whoever.
I want to piggyback on what she said. I think it's really important to give the kids real world problems and put them in touch with real people to solve those problems, because they can have that personal thing to identify it. And I think when you do that, you're going to attract more girls to the program. You're going to attract everybody.
Right.
But at the same time, before you do that, you do need to teach them fundamentals of engineering. So all the statics and all the other stuff, that the kids still need to know that, because they're going to use that stuff to apply it to solve these problems. And then when they're solving these problems, they're going to really see the value in what they're learning and saying, that's why I'm learning this, because I can really help people with this. And it's really going to give them a mission in life to be a better person, to improve the world. I think that's really going to be, you know, a win situation for everybody. For the kids, for the faculty, for the world, for society, period. So,
I also just want to add that I think this is a really important piece, is that it needs to be engineering for all. Because the one thing that I've discovered is that there's a means to helping women and helping minorities, but it's also when you start segregating them so much, they actually get embarrassed. And I'm finding it in my classes, like the Meyerhoffs and the Seawits, and they want to be inclusive. And that's, in my research, I've shown that they don't feel inclusive in their own departments because they feel so segregated as a program. And they feel segregated as they want to be, we're all mechanical engineers, we're all chemical engineers, we're all wanting to be engineers. And I think that what Liz's point is really, really fundamental, which is that, you know what, it's not about so much a label of a mechanical engineer versus a chemical engineer. And I'm going to go back to statics because I teach statics. And what I tell them is, like, you need to see your world as you solving problems every day. Because I tell them, even at the beginning of the semester, once you start going for 5 weeks in, you can start solving problems already in your own environment. So having them create the problems that they can solve, finding the problems that they can actually solve in their own environment. And there becomes like a unified understanding that we're solving problems. It's not about whether you're female or male. It's about how can you solve the problems that you deal with on an everyday basis. Because even with statics, which is such a baseline concept, and I get it, Liz, but it's such a baseline concept, but it's an easy concept to understand and then start solving problems with it as a freshman engineer.
It's just the first time I had.
Yeah, and yeah, so I think it's just getting the fact that they're going to have this immediately. So the question is, in 9th grade, when they learn this, how can they start being engineers and saying, guess what, you're now an engineer. Go solve a problem with this.
Or citizens.
Yeah.
And I think what becomes really important is when we come up with these design challenges and build our curriculum, we have to be very mindful that we can't overlook the math and the science that scaffolds those decisions. Because I've seen too many of like, oh, let's just run and solve this engineering design problem without stepping back and saying, okay, what math, basic math and science principles are going to guide us to make good engineering decisions. We can't forget that fundamental skill.
So as a kind of leadership here, that is the crux of this entire project. Right there, exactly what Taryn said.
Okay.
That
Sign me up.
is exactly what we're looking for, because we see these pendulums swinging in directions, and we have teachers asking for what is the sequence of learning within these. We're doing a grand challenge on water access for children, and we're talking about these scientific concepts. How can I build sequence of learning in math and science to support that context.
Whoa,
It's
I-
perfect.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Exactly.
I just can't stand it, y'all. Engineering is not just math and science. It's history and culture and social studies. It's the ability to communicate.
All of it.
It's
It's
the ability
writing.
to speak, write, and talk about engineering.
Absolutely.
It's the math is the language that we use, and science is what we base our work on. But we need the arts to come up with creative and innovative solutions. So you're not going to get any girls, or really humans, if we go at this as, here's a curriculum with math and science to show you how to do engineering. Because we've been trying that for 50 years, and it hasn't worked.
You're right.
And I'm sorry, my passion, I'm a mentor. I mentor people.
You're right. I think we're
We
all.
need citizens.
I think we're all on the same. I think we're
Yeah.
rowing in the same direction. We're using different terms and different and language alone, being able to have a platform limits our ability to explain all the pieces that we feel mix into that.
And
Right.
I would offer then, as this process moves forward, that needs to come into where does that fit as we're going through this to make sure that we weave that in. So I love the way this is going. You guys are just going to have to pull us off the sofa.
Green shirt is up.
What I do want to do is to be pragmatic, and one key takeaway I want to add is we're looking at the learning progressions, and we are going to jump into that. Tanner's going to do a real quick introduction before I thank this incredible panel and some of the conversations they discussed. Is one key takeaway is we're looking at the learning progressions is Greg and I were just chatting and laughed over this. As we're writing the levels, we don't necessarily need to see just dump trucks and toys, trucks, and where can we put some things in there that are culturally relevant? So Claudia's presentation yesterday was talking about I might not own a clothes washer or something like that. So what put in some examples in the learning progressions that we can think about students from different populations, different areas, different backgrounds. You're going to do square footage because you're cutting grass, but if you don't own a lawnmower type thing. So pulling some things full circle, and I know Tanner's going to jump in here and extend my conversation is, as we're writing those learning progressions, what are the key takeaways from this panel session that we can directly infuse and move forward?
In one of Liz's comments yesterday, she's talked about the apple. Bite it in small chunks, don't choke on it. And so when we look at these types of gatherings, these types of groups, bringing them together, how do we inform each other for the mission at hand? And we're trying to take a small bite, but keeping the big picture in mind.
So can I just wrap this up?
Please do.
Letting
Just
this
a
gentleman
comment,
make a comment, and I would like them each to have one sentence.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the comment I just wanted to kind of go off of what she was saying is with the problem-based learning, that's like one of my favorite parts of engineering. I just feel like a lot of our teachers are prepared, but there's also a lot of teachers that are not prepared for that style of learning. So there needs to be a lot more development as far as like professional development sessions go. Because I've been in a lot of trainings recently being a new teacher, and I've overheard a lot of teachers directly say, I could never do anything beyond the curriculum because they don't have that knowledge base. They don't have that knowledge in engineering in order to create these problems or extra problems for their students to do. So a lot of them feel like if it's not in the curriculum, it's not something that they can do. So a lot of it is giving the teachers the knowledge and stuff like that they need in order to successfully be able to do something like this problem-based learning. So I feel like they just keep taking away our professional development days and stuff like that, and I don't even know if we get one this year. So it's that's something that they really need to work on, giving teachers the opportunity for more professional development, because I feel like as a newer teacher, like our time really isn't valued as much, and they need to give us more opportunities to grow. We're just kind of expected to teach the kids, and then I don't feel like we're given as many opportunities to grow as much anymore. And it's kind of like, that's something that you just need to like do on your own, and like it's not like they don't consider that like part of the job anymore. It's like growing. It's something that you're just expected to do on your own, and we're expected to do more and more on our own. I feel like every year.
We all know that teachers only work 9 months a year for 6 hours a day.
Yes.
That's a whole other culture.
There's that Sarky
That's
back
a whole other
here.
societal construct we have about.
Oh.
Okay,
They
one-
just go in, they leave at 3.
Exactly.
What are you talking about?
So one sentence
You know I'm
each.
being facetious.
Use your resources and be aware of what's around you. So the students, family members, the community, your colleagues, professionals, use everything at your reach to meet the needs of our students.
One sentence. Teach the students. Get to know your students.
Yeah. Same thing, the choir up here.
Yeah.
Really care about your students and meet them where they are and help them find, great opportunities so that they can.
Yeah, with good curriculum
Yeah.
and resources.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
It's okay. Yeah, my phone was buzzing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to give you a chance to grab some coffee, go to the restroom if you need to. We'll be back in 5 minutes. We're going to please reorganize.